The night had already turned ugly by the time the SEALs hit the beach. A storm had rolled in faster than forecast, blotting out the stars with heaving clouds that glowed faintly with flashes of distant lightning. Rain came in sheets, whipping sideways, turning the shoreline into a blur of shifting shadows and violent surf. The Zodiac boats had cut engines and drifted the last 100 yards, paddles slipping silently through the water as the men crouched low, their gear slick with salt spray. They had trained for conditions like this, but as the first squad splashed ashore, faces painted, rifles held high, even the veterans knew this operation had become something else entirely. The enemy compound lay 3 miles inland, buried in a jungle of thick canopy and rising terrain. Their orders were to breach it, secure the high-value target, and exfil before dawn. Under normal circumstances, they would have had drones overhead, AC-130 circling at altitude, and F-15s on standby. Tonight, none of that was supposed to be possible. The storm had grounded half the fleet and thrown the air controllers into chaos. The SEALs had been told flat out, no air cover. Too dangerous. You're on your own. They didn't complain, they never did, but every man carried the weight of that knowledge as heavy as the rifles in their hands. Moving inland was a nightmare. The jungle floor turned to muck under the deluge, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Radios crackled with static and infrared goggles fogged useless within minutes. Still, they pressed on, guided by GPS and gut instinct, slipping past enemy patrols, cutting through razor grass, ears straining for the faintest sound that didn't belong to the storm. Their team leader, Lieutenant Graves, felt the pressure more than most. He knew the target wasn't just some local warlord. Intelligence suggested this compound sheltered a rogue commander with ties to a wider network, a man with enough resources to destabilize an entire region if left unchecked. Graves' orders were simple: capture or kill. The problem was, the compound sat on a ridge with reinforced bunkers and heavy weapons. Normally, a quick airstrike would soften the ground, but without jets, the SEALs were walking into a hornet's nest armed with nothing but their skill and grit. Graves didn't like the odds, but missions weren't chosen, they were carried out. By the time they reached the perimeter of the target, soaked to the bone and caked with mud, the situation had worsened. Enemy spotlights cut jagged cones through the storm, and machine gun nests barked short warning bursts into the darkness as if daring intruders to come closer. Through the storm's veil, Graves could just make out the silhouettes of armored vehicles parked near the main gate. This was no ragtag militia. These men were dug in, disciplined, and expecting trouble. Graves motioned his point man to set charges on the outer fence while the others spread into position, each heartbeat drumming louder in his ears than the thunder above. He knew once the first shot was fired, the compound would erupt, and without overhead cover, their chances of survival shrank to almost nothing. He whispered a silent curse, then thought of the air controllers back on the carrier telling him help was impossible. Maybe they were right. Maybe tonight would end in blood. Miles above, slicing through the storm, Captain Elena Markova didn't think so. She was strapped into the cockpit of her F-15E Strike Eagle, the engines howling like twin beasts behind her as she forced the jet lower into the boiling weather front. Lightning forked around her canopy, rain hammering like bullets on the glass, but her hands were steady on the stick. She had heard the same orders as everyone else: stay grounded, too dangerous. But Elena had flown through worse in her career, and when word came that the SEAL team had been dropped without support, something in her refused to stay idle. She had launched against command protocol, climbing into the night on her own conviction, trusting her jet and her instincts to see her through. To her, the storm wasn't a wall, it was a test. And she had no intention of failing men who would be fighting tooth and nail in the mud below. Every second was a gamble. Radar flickered in and out, the storm's electrical chaos scrambling returns. Elena flew half-blind, relying on raw piloting skill and gut timing, adjusting by instinct when instruments faltered. Her weapons officer in the back seat, Lieutenant Harris, cursed softly every time the turbulence knocked them off course, but Elena's voice over the intercom stayed calm. "We're fine. Stay with me." She could already pick up faint signatures on the ground, the heat of engines, scattered bursts of gunfire as the SEALs made first contact. She knew she was cutting it close. If she mistimed her descent, she could slam into the ridge herself. But if she hesitated, the team below could be overrun. She pulled the throttle, felt the fighter drop, nose slicing through the rain like a blade through silk. On the ridge, Graves heard the compound explode with life. Floodlights blazed, alarms shrieked, and heavy gunfire tore into the night as his breachers detonated the fence. Bullets cracked past his ears, chewing bark from trees, sparks dancing in the downpour. His men moved fast, returning fire in controlled bursts, clearing paths through the chaos. But the enemy outnumbered them 3-1, and the storm made coordination hell. Graves ducked behind a low wall, teeth clenched, shouting into his radio even though he knew no help was coming. Then, over the roar of the storm, another sound cut through, the ripping thunder of a jet engine diving hard and fast. He froze, eyes snapping upward, disbelief hitting him like a shockwave. Out of the black sky, through curtains of lightning, an F-15 burst into view, its afterburners glowing hellfire against the rain. For a split second, it looked like an avenging phantom tearing out of the heavens. Elena leveled at treetop height, the compound suddenly sprawling beneath her like a map lit in fire and tracer rounds. Harris locked onto armored vehicles, his hands steady despite the buffeting turbulence. "Target acquired," he called, and Elena squeezed the trigger. The first missile streaked downward, vanishing into the storm before erupting in a blast that sent steel and men hurtling skyward. The second followed, silencing a machine gun nest with an eruption of flame. Enemy fire turned skyward instantly, red tracers clawing desperately at the storm, but Elena rolled hard, banking left, dragging the F-15 like a predator through the chaos. Graves watched, stunned, as explosions lit the ridge and enemy forces faltered. For the first time that night, survival didn't feel impossible. The SEALs didn't waste the chance. They surged forward, pushing deeper into the compound as the fighter roared above like a guardian angel refusing to let them die in the dark. The compound was in chaos, a storm of fire and steel made worse by the storm of nature itself. Enemy soldiers scattered across the ridge, some scrambling to man weapons while others dove for cover from the sudden airstrikes. Graves' men pushed forward, instincts honed by countless missions guiding them through the madness. Muzzle flashes sparked like lightning among the trees, shouts and screams drowned beneath the deafening crack of thunder. Graves signaled his squad to breach the first bunker, his boots sloshing through puddles, uniform plastered to his skin with rain and sweat. They kicked the door, grenades first, then swept in with rifles raised, clearing rooms in brutal seconds. But even as they gained ground, he knew the fighter above was the only thing keeping them alive. He looked up once more through sheets of rain, watching the F-15 bank and dive, carving through the tempest as though the storm itself bowed before it. Whoever was flying that jet wasn't just skilled, they were possessed with purpose. Inside the cockpit, Elena felt her pulse sync with the rhythm of the storm. Every turn of the stick, every roll, every push of the throttle was a dance between death and mastery. Rain hammered the fuselage, the storm clawed at her wings, but the eagle held firm, a beast bred for dominance, and she coaxed it with the finesse of years spent learning how far she could push without breaking. Harris fed her target updates, his voice strained but steady, calling out heat signatures clustered near the gate. Elena dove low again, skimming the treetops so close she could see branches whip past her canopy. "Fox 3, Harris muttered, and another missile tore loose, slamming into a cluster of enemy fighters who had been forming up near a truck. The explosion blossomed orange against the night, scattering bodies and metal. Elena pulled up, her jet rattling as turbulence clawed at it, but she kept steady, lips pressed into a thin line. Below, men's lives were balancing on the edge of her precision. The enemy, stunned at first, began to rally. Graves saw it in their movements. They weren't just panicked rabble anymore, they were regrouping, leaders shouting orders, heavy machine guns dragged into new positions, RPG tubes flashing as rockets streaked upward toward the shadow of the F-15. "They're trying to clip our Angel," one of his men shouted. Graves barked orders, suppressing fire on the gunners, but his own ammo was dwindling. He knew the fighter wouldn't last long if they concentrated everything on it. For a moment, doubt gnawed at him. What if the pilot got hit? What if that miraculous thunderbolt from the sky was torn apart and all they had left was the mud, the rain, and an enemy ready to crush them? But as he ducked to reload, another earth-shaking detonation rocked the ridge. Elena had dropped a guided bomb, somehow threading it through the storm and into the heart of an ammunition depot. The blast lit the compound like daylight, shockwave rolling down the slope and flattening anyone caught too close. Graves' doubt vanished in the blaze. This pilot wasn't going to leave them hanging. The fight pressed deeper. Graves' team breached building after building, clearing halls slick with water, the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel choking every breath. They found resistance at every turn, men with rifles waiting in stairwells, grenades bouncing across cracked concrete floors, but the SEALs were relentless. Training and discipline carried them forward, even as exhaustion bit into their muscles. Over comms, static-wrapped voices called out kills, movements cleared rooms. Graves knew they were burning through time fast, Reinforcements could be on the way, and the longer they lingered, the worse their odds of escape. He pressed his mic. "Command, this is Reaper Team, we need extraction options, over." Static answered him. The storm swallowed the signal, leaving them cut off. His jaw tightened. They would have to carve their own way out. Above, Elena's jet wasn't faring much easier. The storm was relentless, tossing her with violent crosswinds, lightning flashing so close Harris swore it scorched the canopy. Fuel gauges ticked down faster than she liked, and she knew every minute an afterburner cut their endurance. Worse, enemy RPGs kept spitting upward. Most missed wildly, their operators fighting the rain as much as her maneuvers, but one rocket came so close it clipped across her wing, sparks bursting as the jet jolted hard. Alarms shrieked in her headset, but she forced her hands to stay steady. "We're good," she muttered, more to herself than Harris. The Eagle was bleeding but not broken. She shoved the throttle again, rage and determination burning hotter than fear. No way in hell she was letting the men below get slaughtered. On the ridge, the SEALs finally found their target. He was barricaded in a reinforced chamber at the heart of the compound, flanked by loyal fighters who fired blindly through the door's narrow opening. The standoff threatened to turn into a bloodbath. Graves assessed quickly, grenades would risk killing the target, rushing the door would be suicide. His mind worked under fire, rain dripping from his helmet, when suddenly another thunderous roar split the storm. He realized the pilot above was lining up another strike, and this one was close. He radioed his men, back, take cover." They barely had time to duck when a precision-guided bomb smashed into the far wall of the building, tearing half the structure apart but leaving the chamber miraculously intact. Dust and debris rained down, enemy guards scattered, stunned by the impact. Graves seized the moment, breaching the chamber, his men storming in with ruthless speed. Gunfire erupted, a quick and brutal exchange, and when the smoke cleared, the rogue commander lay shackled, dragged from his bunker at last. Mission objective achieved, but survival was still far from certain. The compound was burning, enemy forces still alive and angry, the storm still raging like the wrath of gods. Graves hauled the target toward the extraction point they had marked earlier, but every step felt heavier, every second stretching. Men were running low on ammo, carrying wounds, breaths ragged from the fight. Then, out of the maelstrom, the jet screamed overhead again, strafing the treeline with cannon fire, scattering enemy squads that had been closing in for pursuit. Graves felt a surge of something he rarely allowed himself in the field: hope. That jet, that unknown pilot who defied the storm and the orders of higher command, was giving them a chance to live. He shouted to his men, voice raw, Move. We've got cover." As they dragged themselves through the jungle, mud sucking at their boots, thunder shaking the sky, Elena kept circling, burning precious fuel to keep the ridge clear. Every warning light in her cockpit screamed at her that time was running out, but she refused to pull back. Harris glanced at the gauges and shook his head. "We won't make it back to the carrier at this rate." Elena tightened her grip on the stick, eyes narrowing as she scanned the terrain for any sign of the SEAL team breaking free of the compound. "We'll worry about us later. They come first." Her voice was iron, her resolve absolute. For her there was no choice, no compromise. If the SEALs had been told air cover was impossible, then tonight she was going to prove impossible was just another word for untried. Rain poured like a living curtain, thick enough to blur shapes and swallow sound, but the SEALs pushed on through the jungle with their captive in tow, boots sinking ankle-deep into mud, rifles held tight despite aching arms. Graves stayed at the rear, scanning the shadows, every sense stretched thin, listening for the enemy's pursuit. The compound was behind them now, flames licking the storm, ammunition still cooking off in bursts that echoed across the ridge. But they weren't free. The enemy was regrouping, chasing them through the downpour, and Graves knew they were one step from being overrun. "Keep moving," he growled, voice rough, pushing his men forward as branches whipped against their helmets. Above, faint through the storm, came the growl of engines, a sound so reassuring it bordered on surreal. The fighter was still there. She hadn't left them. Even in the suffocating jungle, Graves felt it, the unseen shield of a pilot willing to fly into hell itself to keep them alive. Elena's hands were numb on the stick, her body sore from the relentless turbulence, but she refused to give the storm victory. The gauges told her what she already knew: fuel was dangerously low, systems strained, but her focus never wavered. Harris muttered calculations, trying to find ways to stretch their reserves, but Elena cut him off each time. "We're not leaving until they're clear." Her voice was cold steel, carved from sheer willpower. She leveled the jet again, radar flickering with faint returns of bodies moving through the trees. The SEALs were making their escape, but enemy squads shadowed them, closing the distance. Harris called out positions and Elena acted, rolling the F-15 in a steep bank coming around fast. "Guns," she said flatly, and her fingers squeezed the trigger. The cannon thundered, sending streams of fire into the jungle below, ripping apart tree trunks, shredding the undergrowth where enemy fighters had been advancing. It was brutal, imprecise but effective. Even the storm couldn't silence the sound of the eagle's wrath. The ground trembled under the strafing runs, the storm flashing in time with the explosions, as if the heavens themselves were choosing sides. Graves and his men stumbled forward faster, taking advantage of the chaos. The captive, bound and struggling, was half-dragged by two operators who didn't bother with gentleness. Every second counted. Graves' headset crackled again with static, but buried within it was something new. A faint voice from command, distorted but audible. "Reaper, this is Overlord, do you copy? Extraction window closing, storm shifting, hellos won't hold." Graves spat mud from his lips and pressed his mic. "Overlord, Reaper actual, copy. We have HVT. Need immediate pickup." The reply was lost in static, then broke through again. 2 clicks south, clearing marked by IR. "You have 12 minutes. Repeat, 12 minutes." Graves cursed. 12 minutes in this weather felt like eternity, but at least it was something. He shoved his team forward, rallying them with a single order: 2 clicks south, move like your lives depend on it. Enemy fire didn't slacken. Every few minutes, bursts cracked through the jungle, bullets snapping through branches, tracer rounds glowing briefly before the rain smothered their light. Graves ordered return fire only when absolutely necessary, conserving ammunition. The SEALs had discipline enough to obey, fighting only to break contact, never to linger. Their greatest weapon now was speed. Elena tried to help by hammering threats from above, but even her presence couldn't erase the reality. They were hunted men and the jungle itself seemed against them. Roots snagged boots, mud pulled at every step, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down like a second storm. But still they moved. Elena's situation worsened with every pass. The storm's turbulence grew wilder, shoving the eagle like a toy, alarms shrieking in the cockpit as system after system faltered. Harris's tone grew urgent. "We're out of time, Elena. We've got 1 shot left, 1. After that, we won't have fuel to circle." Elena didn't argue. She knew it too. She banked low, eyes scouring the jungle for the telltale flashes of pursuit. Then she saw them, clusters of muzzle fire just behind the retreating SEALs. "One more run," she muttered in Dove. Her jet screamed over the treetops, her cannon blazing in furious arcs that cut down dozens in seconds. She pulled up hard, hammering, lightning splitting so close it bathed the cockpit in white. The eagle bucked and groaned, every bolt and rivet screaming under the strain. Harris swore they wouldn't make it out, but Elena only hissed through clenched teeth, "We're not done until they're safe." The SEALs reached the clearing just as their endurance began to fail. It was a rough patch of ground, open and vulnerable, the jungle cut away by old deforestation. Graves recognized it instantly from satellite briefings, the only space large enough for helicopters in this quadrant. He signaled his men into defensive positions, forming a perimeter as they dragged the target to the center. "Hold until the birds get here," he shouted. It sounded simple, but in reality it was anything but. The enemy was closing fast, angry shouts carrying through the storm, rifles snapping from the tree line. The SEALs returned fire, bursts of light flaring in the darkness, men gritting their teeth as magazines ran low. Graves fired until his rifle clicked empty, then swapped to his sidearm, every shot deliberate, controlled. They were buying time with bullets and blood, and time was the one thing they barely had. The sky above them rumbled, not with thunder this time but with rotor blades. Through the sheets of rain, the shadows of 2 helicopters loomed, tilting as they fought to stay stable in the storm. The sight was salvation and risk all at once. Graves knew the birds wouldn't linger. If they couldn't land fast, they'd have to pull away. He roared into his mic, "Pop smoke." One of his men yanked a canister, purple smoke curling through the rain, struggling to stay visible. The hellos descended, buffeted violently, while enemy fire intensified, bullets zipping toward the vulnerable crafts. Then, in a moment of pure defiance, Elena's F-15 roared overhead again, low and savage, spitting cannon fire into the treeline, scattering enemies just long enough for the hellos to commit. She had saved them again. The SEALs began loading onto the birds, shoving the captive aboard first, then piling in one after another. Graves lingered, covering with his pistol until the last man was clear. He fired his final round, then vaulted into the chopper as it began to lift, skids dragging mud. Enemy tracers lanced upward, chasing them, but the birds clawed into the storm, climbing hard. Graves looked out the open side, breath ragged, watching as the compound and jungle fell away beneath them. They were alive. Against every warning, against every odd, they were alive. And high above, still carving her path through lightning and rain, the eagle banked away, its silhouette vanishing into the clouds like a phantom. Graves didn't know her name, didn't know why she had risked everything, but he knew one thing for certain. Without her, none of them would be breathing. In the cockpit, Elena finally exhaled, a sound somewhere between relief and exhaustion. The fuel light glared red, system strained to the breaking point, and Harris muttered that they'd be lucky to limp back to friendly airspace. But Elena's eyes never left the horizon. She had done what she came for. The SEALs were safe, the target secured. The storm could rage all it wanted. Tonight, she had flown through its heart and carved victory from its teeth. As she turned the eagle toward home, rain streaking across the canopy, she allowed herself a single thought, quiet but fierce. Impossible had just been redefined. The helicopters clawed through the storm, rotors straining against the furious crosswinds as rain slashed sideways through the open doors. Inside, the SEALs sat. Hunched, their faces pale under streaks of mud, sweat, and blood. Some clutched wounds hastily bandaged, others simply stared into the dark, adrenaline still surging too hard for exhaustion to catch them yet. The captive lay bound at their feet, eyes wide with disbelief, the reality of his capture settling in. Graves sat near the door, chest heaving, pistol still gripped tight though the magazine was empty. His gaze drifted to the horizon, searching the clouds for a glimpse of the fighter that had made all of this possible. Lightning forked across the sky, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw it, the faint silhouette of an F-15 banking wide before vanishing again into the storm's chaos. He said nothing, but inside his chest a quiet respect burned. Whoever that pilot was, she had rewritten the night. In the cockpit of her own machine, Elena was holding the eagle together by sheer will. Warning lights glowed across her panels, fuel alarms blaring, hydraulic pressure dipping dangerously low. The storm didn't ease. If anything, it seemed angrier, battering the jet with crosswinds that threatened to shove her from the sky. Harris was pale behind her, hands tight on his console, muttering numbers and fuel calculations like prayers. "We're at bingo," he warned, voice tight. "Any lower and we won't make it back to the carrier." Elena didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the horizon, chasing the faint signal of the helicopters as they banked toward safety. "They're not clear yet," she said simply, determination flat in her tone. She had flown long enough to know this was pushing the edge of madness, but some lines weren't meant to be walked back. She would see them safe even if it meant never making it home herself. The helicopters fought their way south, their crews white-knuckled as they guided the crafts through turbulence. Over comms, static-laced voices barked updates. Weather worsening, carrier repositioning, windows narrowing. Graves caught fragments of the chatter and knew the truth. Survival wasn't guaranteed yet. The storm was chewing up the sky, and even trained pilots could be dragged into the sea by a sudden gust. He turned to his men, checking faces, reassuring where he could. They had the target. That mattered. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the phantom above, the jet tearing through lightning to give them cover. It wasn't procedure. It wasn't protocol. It was something else entirely. He wondered who she was, what drove her to defy orders, and if she realized the debt they now owed her could never truly be repaid. Fuel finally forced Elena's hand. The gauges dipped into the red, and every warning system screamed that the eagle was minutes from falling silent. Harris's voice broke the cockpit's tension. "We've got to divert now or we'll be swimming." Elena's jaw clenched, hands tightening on the stick. She banked toward the vector of the carrier, storm still clawing at her wings, every movement sluggish under the strain of near-empty tanks. The jet felt heavier, uncooperative, like a beast limping back from battle. She coaxed it, murmuring under her breath, eyes narrowing against the rain. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the angry waves far below. One engine coughed, sputtered, then caught again. Harris swore softly, gripping the side of his seat. "You're insane, you know that?" Elena gave the faintest smile. "Takes one to ride with me." Back on the helicopters, Graves finally allowed himself to exhale as the storm began to thin. The worst of the weather seemed to peel away, the sky still heavy but not crushing. Through the open door, he caught glimpses of calmer air ahead, faint starlight breaking through the clouds. The carrier group was near, their path carved by sheer stubbornness and timing. He leaned his head back against the bulkhead, eyes closing for the first time all night. The mission had nearly drowned in chaos, but they had pulled it off. Against orders, against probability, against the fury of nature itself, they had won. And though no one spoke it aloud, every man in that cabin knew the truth. Without the pilot above, none of them would have survived. Elena's eagle limped into visual range of the carrier just as fuel reached the critical line. The deck below glowed with floodlights, a beacon through the darkness. The storm still lashed at her, but she guided the jet with delicate precision, coaxing it lower, her hands gentle yet firm. Harris called out altitude, vectors, fuel countdowns, but his voice was background noise now. Elena was locked into the zone, that razor-thin edge of focus where nothing existed except the jet and the landing. The carrier's landing officer barked through comms, voice sharp with disbelief. Eagle 26, where the hell did you come from? We had you grounded. Elena didn't answer. She lined up her approach, the arrestor cables glistening with rain, the deck swaying with the sea. One last breath, one last prayer, then she dropped the jet onto the deck, hook catching with a screech of steel. The Eagle slammed down hard, shuddering, but it held. They were down. They were alive. The deck crew swarmed instantly, jaws slack as they saw the battered F-15, rain streaming down its scarred fuselage, one wing scorched from a near miss. Harris tore off his helmet, exhaling like a man reborn, while Elena simply powered down the systems with steady hands. She sat in silence a moment longer, the storm raging overhead, then finally unstrapped and climbed from the cockpit. The deck smelled of jet fuel and salt water, but to her it smelled like victory. Officers converged, shouting questions, demanding explanations, but Elena only gave them a steady look, her eyes as cold as the rain. They needed air cover, she said simply. I gave it. No more, no less. When the helicopters landed not long after, battered but intact, the SEALs spilled onto the deck, dragging their captive with them. Graves' boots thudded onto steel, his body aching from exhaustion, but his eyes searched the deck immediately. He spotted her instantly, the tall, rain-soaked pilot standing near her fighter, helmet tucked under her arm, posture unshaken despite the storm still raging. Graves walked toward her without hesitation. He didn't know her name, didn't care about her rank, but he knew what she had done. She had been their sword and shield, their miracle in the storm. He stopped before her, mud still streaking his gear, and extended a gloved hand. You saved us. She regarded him for a long moment, then shook his hand firmly, her expression unreadable. Just did my job. But Graves knew better. This wasn't just a job. This was defiance against the impossible. The storm began to ease at last, the carrier rocking gently as the worst of the weather drifted out to sea. On deck, men moved with renewed purpose, securing the SEALs captive, tending the wounded, and restoring order to the chaos of the night. Graves lingered by the rail for a while, rain washing blood and mud from his gear, mind turning over the events again and again. He couldn't shake the image of the F-15 tearing through lightning like a phantom, the sound of its cannon shredding the night, the sight of fireballs blooming against the ridge. Impossible they had called it. But impossible had been conquered. And as he glanced back at Elena, who stood quietly by her fighter while officers argued around her, Graves knew he had witnessed something rare. Not just courage. Not just skill. But a refusal to accept limits when others had already surrendered. That, he thought, was the kind of defiance that changed wars. The storm finally broke in the early hours, the sky clearing to reveal a pale dawn stretched across the horizon. The carrier deck, still slick with rain, glistened under the rising light as crew members moved with weary determination, repairing, refueling, and resetting after a night that had tested every limit. For the SEALs, it was the first chance to breathe without the weight of bullets snapping around them. They had stripped off their soaked gear, their wounds dressed by corpsmen, and their captive secured in a steel-reinforced cell below deck. Yet none of them were celebrating. Victory had come at the edge of annihilation, and every man knew it. Graves stood apart from his squad near the rail, the ocean stretching endless and gray beyond him, his thoughts circling back again and again to the fighter pilot who had refused to abandon them. He had seen courage before, had fought alongside men willing to die without hesitation, but what she had done was different. It was rebellion against the system itself, a refusal to bow to the word, impossible. He knew command wouldn't see it that way. He knew the storm wasn't over, only shifting. Below deck, Elena stood in the briefing room, her flight suit still damp, hair clinging to her temples. She faced a semicircle of stern-faced officers, their uniforms crisp despite the long night, their voices sharp with disapproval. The admiral, a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair, fixed her with a stare as hard as steel. "Captain Markova," he began, voice clipped, "you were given direct orders to remain grounded. The storm grounded all aircraft for a reason. Yet you chose to disobey. Do you deny this?" Elena stood straight, hands clasped behind her back, gaze unwavering. "No, sir. I disobeyed." A murmur rippled through the room, but the Admiral's expression didn't change. "You risked not only your life and your weapons officers, but also the security of this vessel. Had you gone down, we would have had to mount a rescue in conditions that made rescue impossible. Your decision was reckless, insubordinate, and irresponsible." His words cut like blades, but Elena didn't flinch. She let them fall, then answered with calm defiance. "With respect, sir, had I followed orders, that SEAL team would be dead. And the man they brought back would still be commanding forces on that ridge. The mission would have failed. My actions ensured success." Silence followed, heavy and thick. Harris shifted uncomfortably at her side but said nothing. The officers exchanged glances, some grim, others conflicted. The Admiral's jaw tightened. "That is not your decision to make, Captain. You are a pilot, not the architect of this war. Discipline exists for a reason." Elena's voice remained steady, but inside her chest the words burned hot. "Discipline exists to serve the mission, sir. Not to abandon it." For a moment the air itself seemed to tighten. A battle of wills waged in silence between pilot and admiral. Finally, the man exhaled through his nose, eyes narrowing. "We'll deal with your insubordination later. For now you're grounded. Effective immediately. You will not take another jet off this deck until further notice." Harris's head snapped toward her in shock, but Elena only gave the faintest nod. "Grounded." The word rang in her head like a sentence. She accepted it with a neutral expression, but a storm churned beneath her calm surface. Word of her grounding spread quickly through the ship. Sailors whispered in corridors, SEALs grumbled in the mess, and the story twisted with every retelling. Some called her a hero, others a fool. Graves heard the whispers too, and when he finally tracked her down in the hangar, she was standing alone beside her battered F-15, hands tracing the scorched paneling like a soldier checking on a wounded comrade. "They grounded you," he said bluntly, his voice carrying the gravel of exhaustion. She glanced at him, unreadable, then returned her gaze to the jet. "Yes." Graves stepped closer, his eyes hard. "Without you we'd all be dead. You know that, right?" Elena's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Not everyone sees it that way." Graves studied her in silence for a moment before shaking his head. "Doesn't matter what they see. We see it. My men see it. You saved us. That's the truth." His words lingered, steady and certain, and though Elena gave no reply, something in her shoulders eased. The captive, meanwhile, was already stirring storms of his own below deck. Intelligence officers questioned him relentlessly, digging for networks, allies and caches, but the man was stone-faced, cold-eyed, unflinching. Still, the mere fact of his capture sent ripples across the conflict. Messages crackled in from Allied outposts reporting confusion among enemy ranks, leaders scrambling, chains of command faltering. The mission had struck deeper than expected. Yet with that disruption came danger. Satellite feeds revealed mobilizations inland, convoys moving, communications spiking. Retaliation was coming and everyone knew it. Graves gathered his men in the ready room, briefing them with the calm authority of a leader who refused to show cracks. "They're angry. They'll want their man back. That means they'll hit us harder, maybe sooner than we think. Stay sharp. Stay ready." His men nodded, no complaints, no fear, just the grim acceptance of soldiers who lived in the shadow of war. Elena watched from the sidelines, cut off from the fight by her grounding. She hated it more than she expected. Flying was more than duty, it was who she was, the only place she felt entirely herself. Being grounded was like being caged, wings clipped while battles raged overhead. She spent hours in the hangar, walking the line of jets, running hands over cold metal, listening to the hum of machinery that no longer welcomed her. Harris tried to lift her spirits, cracking jokes, reminding her they'd pulled off the impossible, but the weight of command's disapproval pressed down like lead. "You did the right thing," Harris told her one night, leaning against the fuselage beside her. "They'll see it eventually." Elena shook her head. "Right doesn't matter if they write it down as wrong." Her eyes hardened. "But if they think grounding me ends this, they don't know me." Her words proved true sooner than expected. Just 2 nights after the mission, alarms blared across the carrier. Radar screens lit up with hostile signatures, a swarm of fast-moving craft cutting through the darkness toward the fleet. Enemy retaliation had come swift and brutal, a strike meant to cripple them before they could press their advantage. Pilots scrambled, crews rushed, jets roared to life across the deck. Graves and his men grabbed gear, readying to repel boarders if it came to that. Elena stood at the edge of the hangar, heart pounding as she watched her fellow pilots climb into their jets. She had orders, she was grounded. She was to stay out. But as the klaxons wailed and the deck thundered with engines, a decision burned through her mind with the same clarity as the night of the storm. Rules or no rules, she knew where she belonged. The sirens screamed across the carrier, their sharp wails echoing through every steel corridor and rattling bulkhead as red lights flashed and crewmen sprinted to stations. Deck crews hauled chains, scrambled to arm ordnance, and directed pilots rushing toward their aircraft. The night air smelled of jet fuel and salt, the deck alive with thunder as engines howled to life. Above, the radar screens painted a grim picture. More than a dozen enemy aircraft pushing in fast, supported by long-range missiles fired from positions hidden inland. The enemy hadn't wasted time mourning their captured commander. They wanted blood and they wanted it now. Graves and his men stood ready on the deck's edge, rifles in hand, eyes scanning the black horizon. Boarding wasn't likely, but if even one missile slipped through, chaos could rain onto the deck itself. Elena stood near the hangar doors, her hands clenched into fists as she watched pilots climb into cockpits, each movement stabbing her with the reminder that she was grounded, forbidden, silenced when every nerve in her body screamed to join the fight. Harris rushed past her, helmet under his arm, pausing only long enough to look at her with a mix of apology and determination. "I'll keep your seat warm," he said, voice tight, then sprinted for his jet. Elena felt the burn of humiliation claw at her throat, but deeper than pride was the ache of duty. Her squadron needed every plane they could muster, and she was grounded by politics, by paper rules written by men who weren't standing in the crosshairs. She forced herself to step back, leaning against the cold steel wall as the deck crew signaled the first birds to launch. Twin roars shook the carrier as jets tore skyward, their afterburners slicing through the darkness, climbing to meet the threat head-on. Her eyes tracked them until they vanished into the night, swallowed by clouds and shadows. The radio chatter crackled through the loudspeakers, clipped voices coordinating, calling contacts, locking targets. She could hear the strain in their tone already. The enemy had numbers, momentum, and fury on their side. Elena closed her eyes, every muscle tense. She could obey, remain grounded, watch her comrades fight and maybe die without her, or she could make the choice she had made before, the choice that defined her, consequences be damned. The decision made itself. Elena turned on her heel and strode down the hangar, her boots ringing against the deck. The mechanics working on her F-15 looked up in alarm as she approached. "Captain Markova, you're grounded," one of them protested, wiping grease from his hands. Elena fixed him with a stare so sharp it silenced him. "If I stay grounded, you're going to watch your friends burn in the sky. Get this bird ready. Now." The man hesitated only a heartbeat, then barked an order at his crew. They knew the truth, numbers mattered. And though orders said otherwise, they needed every fighter airborne. The jet hissed and groaned as panels were secured, fuel lines disengaged and weapons loaded at speed. Elena climbed the ladder, the familiar cockpit wrapping around her like a second skin. She strapped in with swift, practiced motions, helmet sliding into place, the hum of instruments flickering alive under her touch. The canopy sealed with a hiss, muting the outside world. For the first time since her grounding, she breathed freely. "Viper 1, you are not cleared for launch," the deck officer's voice barked through her headset as the engines roared to life. She didn't answer. She rolled forward, the deck crew hesitating, then scattering as the raw defiance in her path gave them no room to argue. She lined up with the catapult, the weight of authority pressing down but unable to stop her momentum. "Viper 1, abort launch, that is an order," the control tower thundered. Elena keyed the mic, her voice calm but blazing with conviction. "Tower, this is Viper 1. You can write me up later. Right now we've got a sky to hold." Before another word could come, the catapult slammed her forward, and the jet hurled off the deck into the stormy night, engines screaming defiance into the heavens. The battle unfolded ahead, tracers carving through the sky, missiles streaking and flares blossoming like dying stars. Her radar lit up with hostile contacts, the numbers grim. The first wave of friendlies was already locked in a vicious dance, twisting and diving, breaking locks, firing back. Harris's voice came over the channel, clipped but fierce. "Viper 1? Elena? Tell me I'm not hearing you up here." She smiled grimly, locking onto her first target. "You're hearing me, Harris. And you're welcome." She thumbed the trigger, a missile roaring free, streaking into the black to explode against an enemy craft that had been circling for a kill. Harris's laugh cracked through the static. "Damn it, I knew you wouldn't stay put." Relief surged through the comms as her call sign appeared on their network. One more fighter in the fight. One more chance to turn the tide. The sky became a storm of fire and steel. Elena weaved through missile locks, flares streaking behind her, cannon fire rattling as she closed in on targets. She flew with a precision sharpened by fury, every maneuver threaded with the knowledge that she wasn't supposed to be here, but also that no one else could fly like this. Graves, watching from the deck below, saw the lone F-15 carve into the fight with surgical ferocity, cutting down threats one after another. His men cheered despite themselves, the sight of her jet a reminder that courage sometimes mattered more than orders. Enemy numbers began to thin under the renewed ferocity of the squadron, their formation breaking as panic seeped into their lines. But the danger wasn't over. From the inland radar feed, a new signal emerged, larger, faster, deadlier. A bomber escorted by 2 fighters, racing toward the fleet with payloads capable of devastating the carrier itself. The command center's voices rose with urgency, orders flying to intercept, but every friendly was already locked in combat. Elena saw it on her radar, the glowing mass of death cutting straight for her ship. Her heart clenched. She had no orders to intercept, no clearance, but she didn't need them. She pushed the throttle, her jet screaming forward, climbing to meet the bomber head-on. "Viper 1, break off," the admiral's voice thundered across the channel. Elena ignored him. Harris's strained voice cut in. "Elena, you're going solo against 3. I don't have a choice," she cut back, voice steel. She climbed higher, clouds swallowing her as the bomber loomed closer. The escorting fighters broke off to engage her, missiles streaking. She twisted through them, flares popping, the jet groaning under the violent maneuvers. One missile clipped past her wing, shuttering the jet, but she held steady, teeth gritted, eyes locked on the bomber. Harris's voice barked through the static, "You can't take them all." Elena's tone was calm, almost cold. "Watch me." She fired 2 missiles in quick succession, cutting down one escort in a bloom of fire. The second swung behind her, guns blazing, forcing her into a desperate corkscrew dive. The bomber closed in on strike range, its shadow massive even through the clouds. Elena yanked the jet upward, breaking lock with the escort and charging the bomber headlong. The comms erupted with shouts as command realized what she intended. She wasn't maneuvering for a clean kill. She was charging, dead on, missile racks armed, cannon hot. The bomber loosed defensive fire, but she plowed through it, the jet trembling. As sparks and shrapnel tore across her canopy. Her finger hovered on the trigger, the carrier and every soul aboard depending on her aim. She whispered under her breath, almost a prayer, then fired. The missile leapt from her wing like a thunderbolt, carving a streak of fire through the clouds before smashing into the bomber's nose with a blinding flash. For a heartbeat, the sky itself seemed to split open as the explosion ripped through the massive craft, tearing metal and flame across the heavens. Shards of wreckage spun outward, fiery trails marking the bomber's death spiral toward the sea below. Elena's F-15 shuddered violently as shockwaves slammed into it, alarms wailing, the HUD flickering with angry red warnings. She gritted her teeth, forcing the jet through the turbulence, hands steady on the stick, refusing to let the storm take her. The bomber's remains plummeted into the ocean with a thunderous splash, sending waves rolling outward in the moonlit dark. On the carrier deck miles away, sailors and SEALs erupted into cheers, the looming specter of destruction shattered in an instant by one pilot's impossible charge. But the fight wasn't finished. The second escort fighter, enraged and desperate, dove after her from above, its cannons blazing. Tracers cut the air around her canopy, and alarms screamed again as rounds clipped her left wing, tearing a jagged line through the metal. Elena yanked the stick hard, rolling into a vicious corkscrew, pressing her body against crushing G-forces as the horizon spun around her. She fought for every breath, muscles burning, vision dimming at the edges, but she refused to black out. A burst of cannon fire raked the space she had just vacated, a fraction of a second from turning her into debris. She leveled out, pulled up, then slammed the throttle forward. The F-15 screamed, afterburners blazing as she climbed sharply, baiting her pursuer higher into the thinning air. The escort followed, hungry for the kill, confident the damaged American jet was a simple target. But Elena was never simple. She killed her throttle, flipped her bird over into a gut-wrenching inverted dive, and the enemy pilot overshot in a blur. She snapped back upright, locked him into her reticle and squeezed the trigger. Her cannon spat fire, rounds ripping through his fuselage until his craft bloomed into an orange fireball, fragments scattering like dying stars across the night. Her chest heaved as she steadied her breathing, sweat dripping into her eyes, the jet vibrating with the strain of battle. The skies around her were thinning now. Enemy numbers, once overwhelming, had dwindled to scattered survivors fleeing back toward the coastline. The squadron's voices filled the comms, some triumphant, some ragged with exhaustion, but all alive. Harris's voice broke through the chatter, laughter and disbelief tangled together. "Goddamn, Elena. You did it. You actually did it." She allowed herself a small smile, though her hands never loosened their grip on the stick. "We did it, Harris. All of us." But deep inside she knew the truth. Without her reckless defiance, without her refusal to bow to impossible odds, the carrier would now be sinking, Graves and his men dead, the war spiraling toward disaster. The consequences of her choice hadn't ended, they had only just begun. On the carrier, Graves stood at the rail, watching the burning wreckage tumble into the sea, the reflection of fire painting his face in gold and red. His men were shouting, clapping each other on the back, their voices filled with raw relief. But Graves' eyes stayed fixed on the lone jet cutting back across the horizon, its silhouette battered but unbroken. He knew courage when he saw it, had lived and bled beside men who embodied it, but Elena's defiance was something rarer. It wasn't just bravery, it was defiance against authority, against fear itself, a refusal to accept limits that others declared immovable. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a weapon fate had aimed and fired at the perfect moment. When she finally returned to the carrier, the deck trembled under the impact of her landing. Sparks flew as the tailhook caught the wire, dragging her bird to a jarring stop. Deck crews swarmed immediately, checking the battered frame, dousing sparks, securing her jet. The canopy hissed open, and Elena climbed out slowly, shoulders aching, helmet tucked under her arm. For a moment, the entire deck seemed to pause, eyes on her. Then a wave of cheers erupted, sailors and SEALs shouting her name, pounding their fists against the deck, saluting the pilot who had turned certain destruction into victory. Elena gave no speech, no triumphant gesture, she only nodded once, her expression calm, but her eyes carried the fire of everything she had just done. The admiral, however, was waiting at the base of the ladder. His face was a mask of iron, unreadable as the noise of the deck swirled around them. Elena walked toward him, her boots clanging against the steel, her body aching with exhaustion but her spine straight. The admiral studied her in silence, then finally spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You disobeyed me again. You risked the carrier, your squadron, everything." Elena met his eyes, unflinching. "I saved them." The words hung between them like a drawn blade. The admiral's jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed he might explode with fury. But instead, he exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking toward the ocean where flaming debris still burned on the waves. "We'll settle this later. For now, get below, debrief and prepare for the fallout. Because make no mistake, Captain, you may have won the battle, but the war with command has only begun." Below deck the mood was electric. SEALs and sailors alike toasted her in the mess, their relief spilling over into laughter and shouts. Graves found her at the edge of the room, away from the noise, nursing a cup of water like it was whiskey. He sat across from her, leaning forward, his eyes steady. "You know they'll try to bury you for this, right?" Elena's gaze met his, cool but tired. "They can try." Graves smirked faintly, shaking his head. "What you did out there wasn't just flying. That was, hell, I don't even know what to call it. Insanity. Brilliance. Both." He paused, then added quietly, "If they take your wings, you'll always have brothers in my team. Men don't forget when someone saves their lives." For the first time since landing, Elena's expression softened, just a flicker. "Thank you." Still, the political storm loomed. Reports were already flying through encrypted channels back to command, carrying both the glory and the insubordination of her actions. Some would call her a hero. Others, a liability. The balance between the two could decide not just her career, but the entire war effort. Intelligence officers warned that the enemy, though bloodied, would not stay cowed for long. Retaliation would come again, perhaps fiercer, perhaps cunning in ways brute force could not match. And the man imprisoned below deck, their captured commander, smiled faintly in his cell as if he knew the storm had only just shifted direction. As night gave way to dawn, Elena found herself once more on the deck, staring out at the endless horizon. The sea was calm now, the skies clear, but her mind churned with restless energy. She had saved them, yes. But she had also crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Heroes and traitors sometimes wore the same face depending on who told the story. She stood there silent as the sun rose over the waves, casting light on the battered carrier and the scarred pilot who refused to bow to impossible. The sun blazed high by midday, casting a golden sheen over the endless expanse of ocean. The carrier plowed steadily forward, its deck buzzing with the rhythm of repair and preparation. The smell of scorched metal still lingered from the night's battle, mingling with the sharp tang of jet fuel. Sailors worked with renewed urgency, aware that their victory was not the end, only a reprieve. Below deck, in the operations room, the admiral stood stiffly with his officers, their faces drawn tight as new intelligence rolled in. Enemy communications had spiked across multiple fronts, chatter thick with fury and vows of vengeance. Though the bomber had been destroyed and the enemy strike repelled, it was clear they had struck a hornet's nest. Retaliation was certain. The question was not if but when, and where. Into this tense atmosphere walked Elena, summoned once again to face command. Her flight suit was clean now, her hair pulled back tight, but nothing could wash away the defiance in her eyes. The admiral looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. Around him, the other officers watched with a mixture of suspicion, awe, and irritation. "Captain Markova," he began, his tone flat as a blade, "your actions last night were effective. They also violated direct orders. Twice. You've placed me in a position where every decision I make regarding you will be dissected by politicians, the press, and every commander in the chain of command." Elena stood tall, voice steady. "I understand, sir." The admiral's eyes narrowed. "Do you? Because the truth is, if I follow protocol, I strip your wings and have you court-martialed by the end of the week. That's the clean path. The disciplined path." Silence stretched. Then he leaned forward slightly, voice dropping. "But without your actions, this ship and everyone on it would be at the bottom of the Pacific. That's the other truth. So tell me, Captain, why should I allow you to keep flying?" The question hung heavy, the kind that could decide a life. Elena's jaw tightened. She searched for words, not to defend herself, but to lay bare what burned in her core. "Because rules don't win wars," she said finally. "People do. People willing to go beyond what the book says when everything is falling apart. Discipline matters. Orders matter. But so does knowing when to break them. I didn't fly into that storm because I wanted glory. I flew because if I didn't, men were going to die. If I hadn't launched last night, that bomber would have turned this carrier into a coffin. I don't regret my choices, sir. Not one of them. If that means you ground me forever, then so be it. But if you want pilots who will hesitate when it matters most, then you'll be building a fleet designed to lose." Her words carved through the room like a knife. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others looked away, but none could deny the truth of what she said. The admiral's eyes held hers for a long, charged moment. Then slowly he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "You're reckless, Captain. And reckless pilots get people killed. But you're also right. Sometimes war needs the reckless ones." He straightened. "You'll keep your wings. For now. But understand this. One more stunt, one more disobedience, and I'll be the first to sign your discharge papers. Am I clear?" Elena's heart pounded, but she gave only a crisp nod. "Crystal clear, sir." The admiral dismissed her with a wave, but his gaze lingered as she left, as though still grappling with the paradox she represented. Word of her reprieve spread like wildfire. By evening, the ship buzzed with talk, some calling her lucky, others calling her untouchable, many simply calling her what she was, the pilot who had saved them twice. Graves found her on the deck again, leaning against the rail, staring out at the endless horizon. He joined her silently for a time before speaking. "You know, I've seen men win medals for less than what you pulled off." She smirked faintly. "And I've seen pilots lose careers for less." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter what they put on your record. My men don't give a damn about paperwork. You're one of us now. You ever need boots on the ground, you've got them." The simplicity of his words struck deeper than any medal could. For the first time in days, Elena felt the tension in her chest ease. But the war didn't pause for comfort. Within 48 hours, new intelligence revealed enemy fleets massing further inland, preparing for another strike. The captured commander remained silent, his faint smirk never fading, as though he knew the moves his comrades were making. The carrier group braced for impact, their fighters on constant alert, the SEALs sharpening their knives for the next mission. And through it all, Elena felt the weight of expectation pressing heavier. Her name was whispered with both reverence and suspicion, her presence a reminder that impossible victories often came with impossible choices. The next mission order came at dusk, Another SEAL insertion, deeper inland this time, aimed at crippling the enemy's command network before their fleet could sail. Air support was deemed limited, conditions unfavorable. Elena read the briefing in silence, then looked up at Graves across the table. He gave her a thin smile, the kind that said he knew exactly what was going through her mind. "Don't worry," he said quietly, "we'll get the job done. And if the sky tries to kill us again, I'll be looking for that F-15 diving through it." She smirked back, but the fire in her chest burned hotter. That night, as the SEALs prepared and the ship moved into position, Elena found herself alone in the hangar, her hand resting on the battered skin of her jet. She thought of storms, of burning wreckage, of the line she had crossed and would likely cross again. Heroes and traitors, discipline and defiance, order and chaos, all blurred in the crucible of war. But one truth remained unshakable. When the call came, when the mission teetered on the edge of failure, she would fly. No order, no threat, no court-martial would change that. Because the SEALs had been right once, air cover had been impossible. Until she made it possible. And she would do it again. As the first stars broke across the velvet sky and the carrier's deck lights flared to life, Elena stood ready, her silhouette sharp against the horizon. The war ahead was far from over, but neither was she. Somewhere in the dark, enemies were plotting, storms were gathering, and impossible missions were waiting. And when they came, the pilot who had defied both command and death itself would be there, diving through the storm, wings unbroken, heart unyielding. The end.